Tiananmen had been going on for about a month. Once President Gorbachev of Russia visited China, the students took the opportunity of having all the cameras in the world there in Beijing. They took that as an opportunity to mount their protest. And the protest had been going on in the square for about a month. And there was a colleague of mine who had been there for that entire month and wanted to go home, had to go home. So I was being brought in to relieve this other correspondent, and it was the day of Tiananmen Square. So I arrive in China, and it was, I landed at night, and I have been to China many times afterwards, and getting into China is no easy feat. You go through, customs and immigration, and on that night, I almost didn't even get my passport stamped. I did, but it was like the place was a ghost town. Everybody had gone, and there was a sense of nobody knew where this was going. Nobody knew where this was going. There were burned out hulks of military vehicles along the road. The sky in the background was orange from buildings being on fire. And the closer you got to the square, the more chaotic things got, and there were people running around and screaming, and it was chaotic. There was a sense of chaos. We had very few interactions with Chinese journalists. We had a lot of Chinese fixers, students from Beta University who came over to help us, working as translators and fixers and drivers and that sort of thing. But the main sense that you got from things was that for a while there, the government seemed to lose control. And you could slowly see the government reestablishing control over the coming days. And at one point, the government came in and turned off our transmission. And it was a very public thing. It happened on camera. A military official or government official came up to Dan Rather at the time, who was the anchorman, and told him that they were turning CBS off. And literally just sort of, everything went to fuzz. But we had a very, very resourceful local producer who was able to feed our video out by other means. So even though officially we had been turned off, we were still able to report from China, from Beijing. The Chinese government had and has much greater control over things. When you're working in most other Asian countries, you are freer to go about your daily business. In China, you are required to check in when you get there. In the very beginning, people were reporting out of Beijing with tourist visas, and it was sort of accepted with a wink and a nod. In the months after Tiananmen Square, the government got much more rigid about following the rules. So we had to come in, we had to check in, you had to register, you had to spend at least half of your time. If you were going to be a reporter from Beijing, you had to spend half of your year in China. So things were much more regimented in China. That said, you were pretty much free to go cover stories that the government didn't necessarily approve. We covered underground churches. We covered women's health and AIDS, and so it was sort of schizophrenic. You had to get the approval of the government, but for the most part, the government would allow you to do stories that you wanted to do. In those early years, right after Tiananmen Square, the main mode of transportation was bicycles. There were thousands of bicycles riding along the streets of Beijing, and it was beautiful in a way. It was like this little minuet. You could sort of hear the pedals, and people would have the little bells on the side of their, and with so many people, you'd be surprised that there aren't any people aren't running each other over. It was just sort of this little minuet, weaving through the streets of Beijing. Most people wore very simple suits. You'd call them Mao suits today, but either brown or dark blue. I was there for 4 years and saw such a dramatic transformation from bicycles to cars, from Mao suits to silk blouses and high heels. When the restrictions were pulled off of the economy and people were allowed to blossom, women who were good cooks would start a restaurant in their backyard, and so people would sit in the back of a hutan and eat meals that Mrs. Chen was making, and word would get out that she's a really good cook, and there was like a little foodie thing going on there, and it was such a dramatic transformation in 4 years. I've never ever seen a country do that, and probably never will again. And I had not been there for more than a decade, and I went back in 2013. I didn't recognize the city at all. Didn't recognize it at all. Back in '98, there were a dozen, I don't want to underestimate, but a handful of tall buildings, most of them around Jiangmen-wai, around the international compound, and off in the distance there'd be some other tall buildings. You go back now, it's Manhattan. Yeah. And that's in 20 years. I mean, it's such a dramatic transformation. So that has happened in the perception of Americans watching China as well. Gone from, when I was little, they would say, eat your food because there are kids starving in China. Nobody says that to their kids today. We're sort of saying, watch out, the Chinese are going to eat your lunch. Right. It seems that the government made a pact with the people that we will allow you to express yourself economically, but don't get involved in politics. So once they took the economic restraints off, China blossomed and boomed, beyond blossoming, boomed. And so you've got this whole new generation where, I was reading something the other day about these kids who are like in reality TV shows where they've got so much money and they're the kids of the rich and famous, and they travel all over the world, and they've got, expensive clothes and Gucci and Pucci and Louis Vuitton, and they buy houses in California and houses in Vancouver, and that sort of thing just was not even thought of back in the late 90s. And I think that is the biggest change, that people have been able to express themselves economically. But my real question is, like, will the government be able to keep the lid on politically? Once somebody's able to pick up the phone and make $1 billion deal over the phone, are they going to listen to Beijing saying, you have to do what I say? I just wonder if the political lid will stay on much longer without being loosened a little bit. Certainly the economy, certainly. But a A colleague of mine did a story about all of the overbuilding and how there are whole cities that have been built that are or underpopulated. And that can't sustain. It can't. It's now propped up by government spending, but you just wonder how long that can continue. And since China is such a major player in the world, if China falters, we're all going to feel it. So I find that just endlessly fascinating what China is going to do.